The fluorescent lights in the courthouse hallway buzzed with an annoying persistence that seemed to match the anxiety crackling through the air. Emma Martinez sat rigidly on the cold wooden bench, her 7-year-old frame seeming even smaller than usual as she hunched over her stuffed bunny, Mr. Her mother sat beside her, one protective arm wrapped around her daughter's trembling shoulders, whispering soothing words in Spanish that seemed to evaporate before reaching Emma's ears. It had been exactly 6 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days since that night, the night that had stolen Emma's voice and replaced her bright, bubbly personality with this hollow shell of silence and fear. Counted every single day, hoping each morning that her daughter would wake up and be herself again. But each morning brought the same haunted eyes, the same reluctance to speak, the same nightmares that sent Emma screaming into her mother's bed at 3 in the morning. The waiting room was sterile and unwelcoming, with generic landscape paintings on beige walls and outdated magazines scattered across a scuffed coffee table. A water cooler gurgled in the corner, the only sound besides the occasional murmur of voices from behind the heavy courtroom doors. Emma's eyes remained fixed on the speckled linoleum floor, counting the tiny black dots in the tiles, a coping mechanism her therapist had taught her when the world became too overwhelming. District Attorney paced back and forth across the hallway, her heels clicking an urgent rhythm against the hard floor. She checked her watch for the 15th time in as many minutes, her face etched with concern. This case was critical, one of the most important of her career, and it all hinged on the testimony of this traumatized little girl who hadn't spoken a complete sentence since witnessing a violent crime that had shaken their entire neighborhood. Mrs. Martinez approached cautiously, crouching down to make herself less intimidating. "I know this is incredibly difficult. I promise we'll make this as quick and painless as possible. Emma just needs to tell the judge what she saw that night, just the truth in her own words." His eyes filled with fresh tears. "You don't understand," she whispered, her accent thick with emotion. "Emma hasn't spoken about that night to anyone. Not to me, not to the police, not to her therapist. She can't. Every time we try, she just disappears inside herself. I don't know if she can do this." Inside the courtroom, defendant sat at the defense table with an air of arrogant confidence that made the prosecutor's blood boil. At 34 years old, had a lengthy criminal record, but he'd always managed to slip through the system's cracks, witnesses who suddenly changed their stories, evidence that mysteriously disappeared, intimidation tactics that worked all too well. This time had been certain they had him. This time, there was a witness who had seen everything. But that witness was a 7-year-old girl with severe trauma and knew it. He leaned back in his chair, whispering something to his attorney that made both men smirk. They knew the odds. Children were unreliable witnesses in the best circumstances, and a child who couldn't speak. The case would crumble like at high tide. Judge sat at her bench, reviewing the case file one more time. At 58 years old, she'd been on the bench for nearly 3 decades, and she'd seen every type of case imaginable. But cases involving children always affected her differently, perhaps because she was a mother herself, or perhaps because she'd entered law specifically to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She'd read Emma's psychological evaluation multiple times. The child had witnessed something so traumatic that her mind had essentially shut down her ability to communicate about it. Selective mutism, the therapist called it, a severe anxiety disorder that rendered victims unable to speak in specific situations despite being physically capable of speech. The doctor's report was heartbreaking. Emma had watched her neighbor, Mrs., being attacked during a robbery. Mrs. had died 3 days later from her injuries, and Emma had been the only witness. Judge closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of responsibility. Without Emma's testimony, would walk free. He'd continue terrorizing their community, and another family might suffer what the Martinez family was enduring. But forcing a traumatized child to testify could cause irreparable psychological damage. It was a lose-lose situation, and the judge hated those more than anything. The bailiff, Tom Henderson, poked his head into the judge's chambers. Your Honor, they're ready. But I have to tell you, that little girl out there looks absolutely terrified. I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've never seen a child so scared. Nodded grimly. Send them in 5 minutes. And Tom, be gentle when you call her. Use your grandfather voice, not your bailiff voice. Tom smiled sadly. Already planned on it, Your Honor. Back in the hallway, Emma's rocking had intensified. It was a self-soothing behavior she'd developed after Buddy died. Buddy, her golden retriever, her best friend, her confidant, had been hit by a car just 3 weeks before she witnessed Mrs. attack. The dog's death had devastated Emma, leaving her vulnerable and raw. Then came that horrible night, and Emma's fragile world had completely shattered. Remembered how Emma used to be, a chatterbox who never stopped talking, asking questions, singing songs, making up elaborate stories about fairy princesses and dragons. Teachers had actually complained that Emma talked too much in class. Now, would give anything to hear her daughter's voice rambling on about anything at all. A young victim advocate named Jennifer sat across from them, trying to maintain an encouraging smile despite her own growing concern. She'd worked with traumatized witnesses before, but Emma's case was particularly challenging. In their preparation sessions, Emma had communicated only through nods, head shakes, and the occasional written word. Jennifer had no idea how they'd get her to verbally testify in a courtroom full of strangers, with the man who'd murdered her neighbor sitting just feet away. Emma, Jennifer tried one more time, her voice soft and kind, remember what we practiced. You don't have to look at anyone except the judge. Judge is very nice. She's a grandmother just like your abuela. You can pretend you're just talking to your grandmother, okay? Emma's only response was to clutch Mr., her knuckles turning white from the pressure. Felt her case slipping away before it even began. She'd prosecuted hundreds of cases, won most of them, built a reputation as tough and thorough. But this was different. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was about a little girl's trauma and a community's safety, and she felt powerless to help either. The courtroom doors suddenly seemed massive and threatening, like the entrance to a dragon's lair in one of Emma's old storybooks. Behind those doors waited judges and lawyers and strangers who would all be staring at her, waiting for her to speak words that felt trapped in her chest like birds in a cage. Pressed her lips to her daughter's hair, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. We don't have to do this if you can't. We can tell them no. We can go home. But even as she said it, knew they couldn't. Mrs. had been their neighbor for 5 years, a kind elderly woman who brought them homemade dumplings and taught Emma to count in Mandarin. She deserved justice. Her family deserved justice. And if Emma didn't speak, her killer would go free. The weight of that responsibility was crushing for a 7-year-old to bear. Tom Henderson stepped into the hallway, his weathered face kind and concerned. He took one look at Emma and his heart broke. In all his years as a bailiff, he'd never wanted to let a witness walk away more than he did right now. Miss Emma Martinez, he called softly, as gently as if he were waking a sleeping baby. It's time, sweetheart. Emma's entire body went rigid. Her eyes squeezed shut. A small whimper escaped her throat, the first sound it heard from her in hours. This was it, the moment everything would either fall apart or somehow, miraculously, come together. No one in that hallway, not Jennifer, and certainly not Emma herself, could have possibly imagined what was about to happen next. They couldn't have known that at that exact moment, just beyond the courthouse's main entrance, Officer Jake was walking up the stone steps with his partner. His partner who walked on 4 legs and had a tail that never stopped wagging. Everything was about to change. Officer Jake pushed through the heavy brass doors of the courthouse, the familiar smell of old wood and floor polish greeting him as Bailey's nails clicked rhythmically against the marble floor. The golden retriever moved with grace and purpose beside him, her official service vest gleaming under the building's grand chandeliers. Jake had been a K-9 officer for 12 years, but Bailey wasn't like his previous partners. She wasn't trained to sniff out drugs or track criminals. Bailey's gift was something far more subtle and, in Jake's opinion, far more important. She could sense human pain and knew exactly how to heal it. The courthouse was unusually busy for a Thursday morning. Lawyers in expensive suits rushed past with briefcases, families clustered on benches whispering nervously, and the ever-present hum of hushed conversations echoed off the high ceilings. Bailey's ears perked up, swiveling to catch every sound, her brown eyes alert and observant. She'd been coming to this courthouse 3 times a week for the past 8 months as part of a pilot program, one of the first therapy dog initiatives in the state's judicial system. "Morning, officer," called out the security guard who'd been working the metal detectors since before Jake had even joined the force. Her weathered face broke into a genuine smile at the sight of Bailey. "There's my favorite girl. Come here, sweetheart." Bailey's tail wagged enthusiastically, but she remained at Jake's side, well trained enough to know she was working. Reached into her pocket and pulled out a treat. She always kept a stash specifically for Bailey's visits. "You spoil her," Jake said with a grin, giving the hand signal that released Bailey from her strict heel position. The dog trotted over to, accepting the treat with gentle precision before allowing the guard to scratch behind her ears. "Somebody's got to," chuckled. "Lord knows you work her too hard. Where are you two headed today?" "Judge's courtroom. Got a call about 45 minutes ago, child witness, severe trauma case. They think Bailey might help." His expression sobered immediately. "That poor Martinez girl, I heard about that case. The mother brought her through here earlier. Child looked absolutely terrified. Didn't make a sound, just clutched this stuffed rabbit like her life depended on it." She shook her head sadly. "What this world does to children, I swear." Jake's jaw tightened. These were always the hardest calls, the ones involving kids. He'd seen what trauma could do, how it could hollow out a person from the inside, leaving just a shell behind. But he'd also seen Bailey work miracles. That's what kept him coming back, kept him believing in what they were doing. "Well, if anyone can help her, it's this girl right here," Jake said, patting Bailey's head affectionately. The dog looked up at him with those impossibly understanding eyes, and he could swear she knew exactly what kind of day lay ahead. They made their way through the security checkpoint and up the wide marble staircase to the second floor. The building had been constructed in 1923, and it still retained much of its original architecture: soaring ceilings, ornate molding, and massive wooden doors that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who walked through them. Jake had always thought courthouses were built to make people feel small, to remind them of the power and weight of justice. For a traumatized 7-year-old, it must feel like entering a castle full of giants. As they approached Judge's courtroom, Jake could feel the tension in the air like static electricity before a storm. A small cluster of people stood in the hallway, a well-dressed woman he recognized as the district attorney, a younger woman holding a clipboard who looked like a victim advocate, and a Hispanic woman whose face was etched with worry and exhaustion, her arm wrapped protectively around a small child. The little girl had her face buried against her mother's side, and even from this distance, Jake could see her whole body trembling. And then it happened. Bailey stopped walking. Her entire body went still, her focus laser-sharp on something Jake couldn't immediately identify. He'd learned to trust these moments. Bailey's instincts were often better than his own. The dog's ears pricked forward, her head tilted slightly, and she made a soft whining sound deep in her throat. Not distress, recognition, connection. Emma's head lifted slowly from her mother's shoulder. Her swollen, red-rimmed eyes locked onto Bailey with an intensity that seemed to freeze time itself. For a moment, the bustling courthouse ceased to exist. The lawyers, the advocates, the worried mother, everything faded into background noise. The little girl's finger rose shakily, pointing directly at Bailey. Her mouth opened, and though no sound came out at first, Jake could read her lips. "Buddy." His gasp was audible even from 20 feet away. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears immediately streaming down her face. She whispered, She thinks it's Buddy." Turned to see what had caused the commotion, and her eyes widened at the sight of the golden retriever. She'd heard about the therapy dog program but had been skeptical. It seemed like a gimmick, something that looked good in press releases but had little practical application. Now, watching this silent, terrified child react to the dog's presence, she felt that skepticism crumbling. Jennifer, the victim advocate, immediately understood the significance. She'd read Emma's entire file, including the notes about her deceased dog. The timing of Buddy's death, just weeks before the trauma, had been catastrophic for Emma's mental health. The therapist had written extensively about how the loss of her emotional support animal had left Emma vulnerable, stripped of her primary coping mechanism right when she needed it most. Jake moved forward slowly, carefully, reading the room with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years in crisis situations. Bailey matched his pace, her attention never wavering from Emma. The dog's body language was gentle, non-threatening, tail wagging slowly, ears relaxed, head slightly lowered in a universal canine gesture of friendliness. "Hi there," Jake said softly as they approached. "My name is Officer Jake and this is Bailey. She's a therapy dog. Do you know what that means?" Emma didn't respond verbally, but her eyes remained locked on Bailey. Her breathing had changed, still fast, but not the panicked hyperventilation of moments before. Her grip on Mr. loosened slightly. Looked at Jake with desperate hope. "My daughter, she had a dog that looked just like yours, Buddy. He died 3 weeks before." She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't say the words in front of Emma. She loved that dog more than anything in the world. Jake's heart constricted. He'd seen this before. People who'd lost beloved pets often had powerful reactions to Bailey. The dog seemed to carry some essence of every animal they'd ever loved, as if she could channel their spirits somehow. It was one of the many inexplicable things about Bailey that made her so effective at her job. "Would you like to meet her?" Jake asked Emma directly, ignoring the adults and focusing entirely on the child. "Bailey loves meeting new friends. She's very gentle, I promise." The courtroom doors suddenly swung open with a heavy creak that made everyone jump. Tom Henderson, the bailiff, stood in the doorway, ready to call Emma inside. He took one look at the scene, the therapy dog, the little girl's changed demeanor, the way everyone seemed frozen in this moment, and immediately understood that something important was happening. "Officer," Tom said with relief, "thank God you're here. I'll let Judge know." But before he could retreat back into the courtroom, a sharp voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Objection, Your Honor." The defense attorney's lawyer had followed Tom to the doorway and now stood with his arms crossed, his face twisted in indignation. "A dog? Are you seriously suggesting we allow a dog into these proceedings? This is a court of law, not a petting zoo." The magic of the moment shattered. Emma flinched at the harsh voice, immediately shrinking back against her mother. The progress they'd made in those few precious seconds seemed to evaporate instantly. Jake's hand tightened on Bailey's leash, anger flashing through him. He dealt with plenty of attorneys who didn't understand or appreciate what therapy dogs could do. They saw it as a distraction, a gimmick, a waste of time. They didn't understand that for some people, especially traumatized children, the presence of a gentle, non-judgmental animal could mean the difference between being able to speak their truth or remaining silent forever. Spun on her heel, her face flushed with anger. "Mr. Harrison, that is completely inappropriate. We're not even in session yet and you're already—" "I'm protecting my client's right to a fair trial," Harrison interrupted, his voice dripping with false righteousness. "The introduction of a therapy animal is prejudicial and—" "Enough!" Judge's voice rang out from inside the courtroom, sharp and commanding. The elderly judge appeared in the doorway, her black robes billowing slightly as she moved. At 5'3", she wasn't physically imposing, but her presence filled the hallway. "Mr. Harrison, you will return to your seat immediately. Everyone else in my chambers. now." The judge's steel-gray eyes swept over the scene, missing nothing. The terrified child, the therapy dog, the tension crackling between the attorneys. Her gaze lingered on Emma for a long moment, and something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Bring the dog," she said quietly to Jake. Then, looking directly at Emma with surprising gentleness, she added, "And bring Mr. too. I have a feeling we're all going to need friends today." As the small group began filing toward the judge's chambers, Jake noticed something remarkable. Emma was walking, not being carried, not being dragged, actually walking on her own 2 feet, her eyes still fixed on Bailey. The dog seemed to understand her importance in this moment, moving with extra care and grace, occasionally glancing back at the little girl as if to say, "It's okay. I'm here. You're safe." Inside the courtroom, leaned back in his chair, watching through the open door with narrowed eyes. For the first time since his arrest, a flicker of concern crossed his face. That dog might be a problem. That dog might change everything. He was absolutely right. Judge's chambers were nothing like the intimidating courtroom outside. The space felt more like a grandmother's study, warm, lived in, and surprisingly comforting. Lined 2 walls, crammed with leather-bound law volumes, family photographs, and small knickknacks collected over decades. A worn leather couch sat against one wall, and sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the Persian rug that had seen better days but still held its rich colors. Emma stood frozen just inside the doorway, her small hand gripping her mother's with white-knuckled intensity. But her eyes, those dark, haunted eyes that had barely focused on anything for months, were locked on Bailey with laser-like precision. The dog sat patiently beside Officer, her tail creating a soft swishing sound against the rug, her gentle face radiating the kind of unconditional acceptance that only animals seem capable of offering. Judge settled into her high-backed chair and gestured for everyone to sit, and Jennifer took seats on the couch, while guided Emma to a smaller chair near the window. Jake remained standing with Bailey, instinctively positioning them where Emma could easily see the dog without feeling overwhelmed. "Now," the judge began, removing her reading glasses and letting them hang from the chain around her neck, "let's talk about what's actually happening here. Mrs. Martinez, officer, help me understand." His voice trembled as she spoke, her accent thickening with emotion. "My Emma, she had a dog named Buddy, golden retriever just like this one. They were," she paused, searching for the right words. "They were like one soul in 2 bodies, you know." Emma would tell Buddy everything, all her secrets, all her dreams, all her fears. When she came home from school, Buddy was the first one she looked for. When she had nightmares, Buddy would sleep by her bed. The judge nodded, her experienced eyes understanding more than was being said. "And Buddy passed away." 3 weeks before that night, confirmed, fresh tears sliding down her cheeks. "Hit by a car right in front of our house. Emma saw it happen. She screamed and then," his voice broke. "And then 3 weeks later she saw Mrs. attacked and she just stopped. Stopped talking, stopped smiling, stopped being Emma." Jennifer leaned forward, adding her professional perspective. "The trauma therapist believes the loss of Buddy removed Emma's primary coping mechanism right before she experienced a second, even more severe trauma. It created what they call a compound traumatic response. Emma's mind essentially shut down her ability to verbally process what happened." Judge turned her attention to Emma, who was still staring at Bailey with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. The child's lips were moving slightly, forming silent words that no one could hear. "Emma," the judge said gently, her voice taking on the warm tone she reserved for her own, "that's a very special dog. Her name is Bailey. Would you like to know about her?" Emma's eyes flickered to the judge for just a second before returning to Bailey. It was the first time she'd acknowledged anyone else's presence since entering the room, gasped softly at this tiny miracle. Jake recognized his cue. He'd done this hundreds of times, introducing Bailey to people in crisis, explaining her purpose, building trust. But something about this moment felt different, more important, more fragile. Bailey is 3 years old, Jake began, his voice gentle and unhurried. She's what we call a therapy dog, which means her job is to help people who are sad or scared or hurt. She's really good at her job because she has a superpower. She can feel what people are feeling, and she knows exactly how to make them feel better. Emma's head tilted slightly, a gesture so subtle that only who'd memorized every nuance of her daughter's body language noticed it. It meant Emma was listening, really listening. Bailey works with me at the courthouse 3 days a week, Jake continued. She meets lots of people who are nervous about being here. Big people, small people, young people, old people, and you know what? They all feel better after spending time with Bailey. It's like magic, except it's real. Watched this unfold with growing amazement. In all her years as a prosecutor, she'd never seen anything like this. The child who couldn't speak, who couldn't even look at people, was completely focused on this dog. It was as if Bailey had opened a door that everyone else had been pounding on for months. "Buddy," Emma whispered suddenly, so softly that everyone leaned forward to make sure they'd heard correctly. Buddy came back. The room went absolutely still. His hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. Those were the first words Emma had spoken in 6 months, 2 weeks and 4 days, not counting the occasional yes or no that had been dragged out during therapy sessions. Judge felt her throat tighten with emotion, but she kept her voice steady and calm. "Honey, that's not Buddy. That's Bailey. But I bet Buddy and Bailey would have been friends if they'd met. They're both very special dogs." Emma shook her head stubbornly, her first real gesture of self-assertion in months. "Buddy sent her," she said, her voice still barely above a whisper but growing slightly stronger. "He sent her to help me." Jake felt his own eyes burning with unexpected tears. In all his years working with Bailey, he'd seen the dog help countless people, but this was something transcendent. This child was rebuilding her understanding of the world in real time, creating a narrative that allowed her to accept help, to believe in safety again. "You know what?" Jake said, making a decision that was probably against protocol but felt absolutely right. "I think you might be onto something there, Emma. Bailey does seem to know exactly who needs her most. It's like she's got a connection to the universe, or to other dogs who loved their people very much. Maybe Buddy did send her to you." Jennifer shot him a concerned look. "You weren't supposed to encourage magical thinking in traumatized children. It could delay recovery." But Jake ignored her. Sometimes, healing wasn't about following the rules in the textbook. Sometimes, it was about meeting someone exactly where they were and walking with them from there. "Can I?" Emma's voice cracked and she had to start again. "Can I touch her?" "Of course you can," Jake said warmly. He looked at Mom. "Is it okay if Emma comes closer?" Nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She released her daughter's hand, and for the first time in months, Emma moved independently towards something instead of trying to hide from it. The little girl slid off her chair and took 3 tentative steps toward Bailey. The dog remained perfectly still, though her tail continued its gentle wagging. Jake gave a subtle hand signal, and Bailey lay down, making herself smaller and less intimidating. Emma dropped to her knees in front of Bailey, Mr. Forgotten on the floor beside her. Her small hand reached out, trembling, and touched the top of Bailey's head. The dog's golden fur was soft and warm, and beneath Emma's palm, she could feel the solid, real presence of a living, breathing creature who radiated nothing but gentleness and acceptance. "Hi, Buddy," Emma whispered, and then her face crumpled. 6 months of held in grief, terror, and pain came pouring out in great, racking sobs. She collapsed against Bailey's side, burying her face in the dog's fur, and cried in a way she hadn't been able to cry since that horrible night. Bailey didn't move. She simply lay there, a warm, steady anchor in Emma's storm of emotion, occasionally turning her head to gently lick the tears from the child's face. The dog's training was impeccable, but this went beyond training. This was pure instinct, pure compassion. the kind that transcends species and speaks directly to the wounded soul, slid off the couch and onto the floor beside her daughter, wrapping her arms around Emma from behind. Mother and daughter clung to each other and to Bailey, and the tears that had been up for so long finally flowed free. Judge turned away, ostensibly to look at something on her desk, but really to wipe her own eyes. In 30 years on the bench, she'd witnessed countless dramatic moments, but few had touched her as deeply as this. Didn't even try to hide her tears. Jennifer scribbled notes with shaking hands, documenting what would undoubtedly become a case study in trauma therapy. Jake stood quietly, one hand resting on his duty belt, watching Bailey work her magic. He'd known from the moment he'd started training her that she was special, but days like this reminded him just how special. She wasn't just a dog, she was a healer, a bridge between pain and hope. After several minutes, Emma's sobs began to quiet. She pulled back slightly from Bailey, her face blotchy and tear-streaked, her eyes swollen but somehow clearer than they'd been in months. She looked at the dog with wonder and something approaching peace. "You're a good dog," Emma told Bailey seriously, her voice hoarse but audible. "Just like Buddy was a good dog." Bailey's tail thumped against the floor in response, and the dog lifted one paw, placing it gently on Emma's knee. A gesture of comfort and connection that Bailey had never been specifically trained to do, but seemed to know was needed. Judge cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the difficult reality they were facing. "Emma, sweetie, I need to ask you something important. Do you think, with Bailey here, you might be able to talk about what you saw that night? The night Mrs. was hurt." The room tensed. This was the critical moment. Emma had found her voice again, but would she be able to use it for the purpose they all needed? Would she be able to testify? Emma looked down at Bailey, her small hand still resting on the dog's head. She was quiet for a long moment, and everyone held their breath. Then slowly, Emma nodded. "If Bailey stays with me," she said, her voice small but determined, "I can try." Judge felt relief wash over her, followed immediately by a wave of new concerns. What Emma was suggesting, having a therapy dog at the witness stand during testimony, was unprecedented in their jurisdiction. The defense would object strenuously. There would be appeals, complications, accusations of prejudicing the jury. But looking at this brave little girl, who was finally finding her way back to herself with the help of a gentle golden retriever, the judge knew exactly what she was going to do. "Then Bailey will stay with you," Judge said firmly. "I promise." Outside her chambers, through the heavy wooden door, the machinery of justice waited. A defendant who deserved to be held accountable. A courtroom full of people. Rules and procedures and precedents. But in this moment, in this sun-filled room, none of that mattered as much as the small miracle they'd just witnessed. Emma had found her voice. Now they just had to help her use it. The moment Judge, Officer Emma, and the others stepped back into the courtroom, defense attorney Richard Harrison was on his feet like a jack-in-the-box wound too tight. His expensive Italian suit couldn't hide the tension radiating from his body, and his face had turned an alarming shade of red that clashed with his power tie. "Your Honor," Harrison's voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls with theatrical outrage. "I must strenuously object to these highly irregular proceedings. A therapy dog at the witness stand. This is unprecedented, prejudicial, and frankly absurd. We are in a court of law, not a circus." Sat beside his attorney, his earlier confidence replaced with barely concealed anxiety. He leaned forward, whispering urgently to Harrison, his eyes darting between the judge and the golden retriever who was calmly walking beside the little girl he'd hoped would be too terrified to testify. This wasn't supposed to happen. The kid was supposed to be too scared to talk. That's what his sources had told him. That's what he'd been counting on. Judge moved to her bench with deliberate slowness, her black robe swishing with each measured step. She'd been a judge long enough to know that how she handled the next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of this case, but potentially set precedent for vulnerable witnesses throughout the state. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders, but she'd never been one to shy away from doing what was right, even when it was difficult. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel that made even the court stenographer sit up, "please be seated. I will hear your objections in an orderly manner." Harrison remained standing, his hands gripping the defense table. "Your Honor, the presence of a dog, a prop, essentially, is designed to elicit sympathy from the jury and prejudice them against my client. It's manipulative and—" "There is no jury present at this moment, Mr. Harrison," Judge interrupted coolly. "We are in preliminary proceedings. Sit down." The attorney reluctantly lowered himself into his chair, though his body remained rigid with indignation, grabbed his sleeve, whispering more urgent instructions that Harrison waved away impatiently. Rose from the prosecution table, her earlier tears replaced with the fierce determination that had made her one of the state's most respected prosecutors. "Your Honor, if I may address the court." Judge nodded. "Go ahead, Ms." "Your Honor, the use of therapy animals for traumatized witnesses is not as unprecedented as defense counsel suggests. In the past 5 years, at least 17 states have successfully implemented similar programs." Pulled out a folder she'd hastily assembled during their time in chambers, her paralegal having worked at lightning speed to gather the information. "California, Washington, New York, and Florida have all allowed therapy dogs to accompany child witnesses during testimony. The practice has been upheld on appeal multiple times." Harrison shot back up. "Those cases involved different circumstances, and more importantly, Your Honor, even if other courts have made this mistake, that doesn't mean we should. The presence of a dog creates an emotional appeal that—" "That what, Mr. Harrison?" Judge's voice cut through his objection like a scalpel. "That makes a traumatized 7-year-old child feel safe enough to testify about watching her neighbor be murdered. That allows a witness to actually speak instead of sitting in silence while a violent criminal walks free." The courtroom went deadly quiet. Judge rarely showed emotion from the bench, and when she did, it commanded absolute attention. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Harrison began. "With all due respect, Mr. Harrison, I have been on this bench for 29 years. I have presided over thousands of cases. I have seen victims justice because the system traumatized them further. I have watched violent offenders go free because witnesses were too terrified to speak. And I have spent sleepless nights wondering if there was something, anything, I could have done differently." She removed her glasses, fixing Harrison with a gaze that had withered more confident attorneys than him. "Today, I have an opportunity to do something differently, and I intend to take it." Harrison's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, I must remind the court that my client has rights. The Sixth Amendment guarantees him a fair trial, which includes the right to confront witnesses against him without—" "Without what?" Judge leaned forward. "Without those witnesses having support, without accommodations for their disabilities. Because that's what we're talking about here, Mr. Harrison. Emma Martinez has been diagnosed with severe trauma-induced selective mutism. That is a recognized disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The law requires, not suggests but requires, that we provide reasonable accommodations for witnesses with disabilities." Nodded vigorously, adding, "The ADA clearly states that modifications must be made to policies and procedures to ensure equal access to the judicial process. Denying Emma the support of a therapy dog would be discriminatory." Harrison sputtered. "The dog's presence will influence how people perceive the testimony. It sends a message that the witness needs protection, which implies my client is dangerous." "Your client is dangerous, Mr. Harrison," Judge said flatly. "He's charged with first-degree murder. The question before this court is not whether he's dangerous. The evidence will speak to that. The question is whether a traumatized child witness will be provided with a legally mandated accommodation that allows her to testify." Jake stood quietly near the back of the courtroom with Bailey and Emma, watching the legal battle unfold. Emma pressed against her mother's side, one hand resting on Bailey's head, her eyes wide as she watched the angry man in the suit yell about her. The dog sensed the child's rising anxiety and leaned more firmly against her leg, providing steady pressure that grounded her. "Your Honor," Harrison tried a different tack, his voice taking on a tone of reasonable concern, "I'm simply worried about the integrity of the proceedings. How can we ensure the testimony isn't coached or influenced by the presence of the handler? How do we know the dog won't distract the witness or other court personnel?" Officer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if I may." Judge nodded. "Officer, please approach." Jake walked forward, Bailey matching his pace perfectly, her service vest marking her as a professional working animal. Emma's eyes followed them, a look of panic crossing her face until whispered reassurances that Bailey would come back. "Your Honor," Jake began, his voice steady and professional, "I've been working with therapy dogs in crisis situations for 12 years. Bailey specifically has been certified by Therapy Dogs International and has completed specialized training for courtroom support. She's been evaluated by veterinary behaviorists and has an impeccable record." He pulled documentation from his jacket pocket. "I have her certification papers here, along with insurance documentation, and a letter from the state's Victim Services Division endorsing her use in cases involving traumatized witnesses. As for coaching or influence, I can testify under oath that I will give no signals or cues to either the dog or the witness beyond what's necessary for Bailey's welfare. The dog's presence is purely for emotional support. She doesn't speak, doesn't gesture, doesn't influence testimony in any way." Harrison crossed his arms. "And yet her very presence is influential. A jury seeing a child clinging to a dog while testifying against my client will naturally assume that the child experienced something traumatic," Judge finished. "Which is exactly what the evidence will show, Mr. Harrison. The dog's presence doesn't create prejudice. It simply allows testimony to occur in the first place." The judge paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Let me be crystal clear about something. I have reviewed the psychological evaluations. I have read the therapist's reports. Without accommodation, Emma Martinez cannot testify. It is not that she won't, she cannot. Her disability prevents it. So our options are these. We allow the therapy dog or we lose the testimony entirely." "Then perhaps we should lose the testimony," Harrison said coldly. "If a witness cannot testify without props and emotional support animals, perhaps that testimony isn't reliable enough for a murder trial." The words hung in the air like poison gas, made a small sound of distress, pulling Emma closer. Hands clenched into fists. Even the court stenographer looked appalled. Judge's expression turned to ice. "Mr. Harrison, you have just suggested that victims of trauma should be excluded from the justice system because their trauma makes them inconvenient witnesses. Do you realize what you're saying?" Harrison had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but he pressed on. "I'm saying that the rules exist for a reason, Your Honor. We can't simply change them because we feel sorry for someone." "You're right," Judge said quietly. "We can't change the rules because we feel sorry for someone, but we can and must interpret them in a way that serves justice while protecting the vulnerable. That's not feelings, Mr. Harrison. That's the law." She opened a thick legal volume on her bench, one she'd had her clerk retrieve during the recess. The Maryland Court of Special Appeals ruled in 2008 that therapy dogs could accompany child witnesses. The court found that such accommodation was analogous to allowing a child to hold a teddy bear or having a support person present, both of which have long been accepted practice. Jumped in with additional citations. The Supreme Court has repeatedly held that trial courts have broad discretion in managing their courtrooms and protecting witnesses, especially children. In Maryland v. The court recognized that the state has a compelling interest in protecting child witnesses from trauma. Harrison shook his head stubbornly. Those cases are distinguishable, and frankly, Your Honor, if you allow this, we will appeal immediately. This case will be tied up for years while appellate courts sort out whether you've committed reversible error. It was a threat, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Judge could play it safe, deny the accommodation, and let the case fall apart when Emma couldn't testify. No one would fault her for following traditional procedure. Her reputation would remain untarnished. Or she could take a stand, risk being overturned on appeal, and face potential criticism for being too emotional, too sympathetic, too willing to bend the rules. Judge looked at Emma, this tiny, traumatized 7-year-old who'd witnessed something horrific and lost everything that made her feel safe. Then she looked at, who sat smirking slightly, confident that legal technicalities would save him from consequences once again. She thought about her 30 years on the bench, about all the cases she'd presided over, the lives she'd touched, the decisions she'd made. She thought about why she'd become a judge in the first place, not to serve the rules, but to serve justice through the rules. And she made her decision. "Mr. Harrison," Judge said, her voice ringing with absolute authority, "your objection is noted and overruled. Bailey will be permitted to accompany Emma Martinez during her testimony. If you wish to appeal, that is your right. But in my courtroom, we will accommodate witnesses as the law requires, and we will ensure that justice has a fighting chance." She banged her gavel once, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "This court stands in recess for 15 minutes. When we return, we will hear Emma Martinez's testimony, with her therapy dog present. Are we clear?" Harrison's face was scarlet, looked like he'd swallowed something bitter, but there was nothing more they could say. Judge had drawn her line in the sand. And she wasn't backing down. The 15-minute recess felt simultaneously too short and unbearably long. Judge had ordered that Emma be given a quiet space to prepare, away from the courtroom's oppressive atmosphere and prying eyes. A small conference room adjacent to the court chambers had been hastily cleared, and now it served as a sanctuary where something miraculous was unfolding. Emma sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor, her small frame seeming even tinier in the spacious room. Bailey lay stretched out beside her, the dog's body creating a warm, golden barrier between Emma and the rest of the world. Officer Jake sat in a chair near the door, close enough to supervise but far enough away to give them space. Stood by the window, her hands clasped together as if in prayer, hardly daring to breathe as she watched her daughter truly interact with another living being for the first time in months. Emma's fingers moved slowly through Bailey's soft fur, tracing patterns only she could see. The repetitive motion seemed to calm something deep within her, the same way petting Buddy used to soothe her fears after nightmares or bad days at school. Her lips moved constantly now, forming words in a whisper so soft that no one else could hear them. But she was talking. To Bailey, to herself, to the memory of Buddy. It didn't matter. The dam had broken and words were flowing again. "I was so scared when Buddy died," Emma murmured, her voice gradually becoming audible as her confidence grew. "I didn't get to say goodbye. One minute he was there and then he wasn't. I kept thinking it was my fault. Maybe if I'd held his leash, maybe if I'd been paying more attention." Bailey turned her head, her warm brown eyes meeting Emma's with such understanding that it seemed impossible she was just a dog. She shifted slightly, moving closer so that her muzzle rested gently on Emma's lap, a gesture of pure comfort that required no words. Jennifer, the victim advocate, sat quietly in the corner, tears streaming silently down her face. She'd worked with traumatized children for 8 years and had never witnessed such a profound breakthrough. The textbooks talked about trauma bonding and animal-assisted therapy, but seeing it happen in real time was something entirely different. This wasn't just therapy, this was transformation. "You know what's funny?" Emma continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. "Mrs. told me that Buddy went to a special place where all good dogs go. She said he was probably playing with her dog, Machi, who died a long time ago. She said they were having adventures together and that one day I'd see him again. Pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Mrs., the kind neighbor who'd been brutally murdered, had tried to comfort Emma about Buddy's death just days before her own death. The cruel irony of it was almost too much to bear. Mrs. was nice, Emma said, and for the first time she was talking about that night without being directly asked. She always gave me those little candies, the strawberry ones with the wrapper that looks like a strawberry, and she taught me how to say hello in Chinese. I can still remember. Bailey's tail thumped softly against the carpet, as if encouraging Emma to continue. Jake watched in amazement. He'd seen Bailey help many people, but the dog seemed to understand that this child needed something more, needed to process not just the trauma of witnessing violence, but the compounded grief of losing her beloved pet just weeks before. The night it happened, Emma's voice dropped to barely a whisper and tensed. I couldn't sleep. I kept having nightmares about Buddy, about the car, about the sound he made when. She stopped, unable to finish. Bailey pressed closer and Emma wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, drawing strength from the embrace. I went downstairs to get some water, Emma continued after a moment. Mommy was asleep. I looked out the kitchen window because sometimes looking at the stars made me feel better. That's when I saw Mrs. The room was absolutely silent except for Emma's small voice and the gentle sound of Bailey's breathing. Jake remained perfectly still, knowing that any interruption could shatter this fragile moment of unburdening. She was taking out her trash, Emma said. Late trash pickup was on Thursdays, and she always waited until right before bed to take it out. She told me once it was because raccoons would get into it if she left it out too early. A tear slid down Emma's cheek. She was wearing her pink slippers, the fuzzy ones. I always liked those slippers. Slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, no longer able to stand. She'd never heard Emma talk about that night. Not to the police, not to the therapists, not to anyone. And now, in this quiet room with a therapy dog, her daughter was finally releasing the poison that had been festering inside her for so long. That's when the man came. Emma's voice trembled, but she didn't stop. Her fingers gripped Bailey's fur more tightly, anchoring herself. He came from the side of her house, from the shadows. Mrs. didn't see him at first. She was just putting the trash can by the curb, humming one of her Chinese songs. Bailey seemed to sense Emma's rising distress. The dog shifted position, carefully maneuvering so that she could rest her head directly on Emma's chest, a technique called deep pressure therapy that Jake had seen Bailey perform instinctively dozens of times. The weight and warmth of the dog's head over Emma's heart had an immediately calming effect. He grabbed her, Emma continued, her voice steadier now with Bailey's grounding presence. She screamed, and I almost screamed too, but I was so scared. I thought if I made noise, he'd see me in the window. He'd come for me too. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I was such a coward, Bailey. I just stood there. I didn't call 911 right away. I didn't yell for Mommy. I just froze. Oh, me, breathed, her own tears flowing freely. You were not a coward. You were 7 years old and terrified. You didn't do anything wrong. But Emma shook her head against Bailey's fur. I should have helped her. If I'd called for help faster, maybe the police would have gotten there in time. Maybe Mrs. would still be alive. Maybe she'd still be giving me strawberry candies and teaching me Chinese words. This was it, the core of Emma's trauma. Not just witnessing the violence, but the crushing guilt of believing she could have prevented it. The weight of that guilt had been too heavy for a 7-year-old to carry, too painful to speak aloud. So she'd locked it away, along with her voice, hoping that silence would somehow make it hurt less. Jake knew he should let the therapist handle this, but something in Emma's broken voice compelled him to speak. Emma, he said gently, can I tell you something about Bailey? The little girl looked up at him, her face streaked with tears. Before Bailey became a therapy dog, she failed her first training program, Jake said. She was supposed to be a guide dog for the blind, but she kept getting distracted. She'd stop to check on people who seemed sad. She'd refuse to walk past someone who was crying. The trainers said she was too empathetic, too sensitive to other people's emotions. They said she'd never make it as a working dog. Emma's eyes widened slightly, her attention caught by this unexpected story. But then someone realized that the thing that made Bailey fail at being a guide dog was exactly what would make her perfect as a therapy dog, Jake continued. Her sensitivity wasn't a weakness, it was her superpower. She didn't fail because she was bad at her job. She just had a different job she was meant to do. He leaned forward slightly. You didn't fail, Mrs. Emma. You were 7 years old and you witnessed something terrible. Your brain did exactly what it was supposed to do. It protected you by keeping you safe and quiet. That's not cowardice. That's survival. And afterward, when everything felt too big and too scary, your mind protected you again by making it hard to talk about. That's not weakness. That's your brain trying to take care of you the only way it knew how. Emma stared at him, processing his words. Bailey lifted her head from Emma's chest and gently licked the tears from the child's face, her rough tongue surprisingly gentle. Mrs. wouldn't want you to feel guilty, added softly, moving closer to her daughter. She loved you. The last time I talked to her, just 2 days before she died, she told me what a special girl you were. She said you had the kindest heart she'd ever seen in a child. She wouldn't want that kind heart to be broken by guilt that doesn't belong to you. Emma was quiet for a long moment, her small hand still buried in Bailey's fur. The dog remained perfectly still, a living, breathing anchor in the storm of Emma's emotions. I miss her, Emma finally whispered. I miss Mrs. and I miss Buddy, and I miss feeling safe. I know, baby, said, tears streaming down her face. I know you do. But Bailey makes me feel a little bit safe, Emma added, looking down at the dog with something approaching wonder. It's like maybe Buddy did send her, or maybe Mrs. asked him to send her, or maybe it's just magic, good magic, not scary magic. Jake smiled through his own tears. He wasn't ashamed to admit this case had gotten to him. Maybe it's all of those things, or maybe Bailey's just really good at her job. Either way, she's here now, and she's not going anywhere until you're ready. Emma took a deep, shuddering breath. The first full breath had seen her daughter take in months. The man who hurt Mrs., she said quietly, her voice taking on a new quality, not quite strength but determination. He's in that courtroom, isn't he? That's him. Jennifer exchanged a glance with Jake. This was the moment they'd been hopping for and dreading in equal measure. Yes, Jennifer said gently. That's him. And the judge, the nice lady you met, she needs you to tell her what you saw that night, but only if you feel ready, only if you feel like you can. Emma looked down at Bailey and the dog looked back at her with those impossibly understanding eyes. Will you stay with me? Emma asked the dog. The whole time, you won't leave. Bailey's tail thumped twice against the carpet, as if answering in the affirmative. Emma turned to Officer. You promise you'll stay? I promise, Jake said solemnly. I'll be right there too, and your mom will be there. And Judge won't let anything bad happen to you. You're safe, Emma. I know it doesn't feel like it, but you are. Emma sat quietly for another minute, her small body pressed against Bailey's larger one, drawing courage from somewhere deep inside herself, a well of strength she didn't know she possessed. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she whispered. I can do it, for Mrs. She deserves for people to know what happened. She deserves. Emma's voice broke, but she forced the words out. She deserves for people to remember that she was kind and that she didn't deserve what happened to her. Knelt beside her daughter, pulling both Emma and Bailey into an embrace. I'm so proud of you, me, so proud. There was a soft knock at the door. Tom Henderson, the bailiff, poked his head in apologetically. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Judge is ready to reconvene. It's time. Emma stood up on shaky legs, one hand buried in Bailey's fur, the other clutching Mr. She looked very small and very young and very, very brave. "I'm ready," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough for everyone to hear. And she was. The courtroom felt different when they returned. The air seemed heavier, charged with anticipation and something close to reverence. Word had spread during the recess about what was happening, about the little girl and the therapy dog, and every person present understood they were about to witness something extraordinary. The usual courtroom chatter was absent. Instead, there was a profound silence, the kind that comes when people collectively hold their breath. Emma walked down the center aisle, her steps small and hesitant but steady. Bailey moved beside her, the dog's golden presence like a beacon of calm in a sea of anxiety. Emma's right hand was tangled in Bailey's fur, her left clutching Mister against her chest. Followed close behind, her face a mixture of pride and terror for what her daughter was about to endure. Officer brought up the rear, his eyes scanning the room, alert for any sign of disruption. Sat at the defense table, his earlier smirk completely gone. He leaned forward slightly, watching Emma's approach with narrowed eyes. There was something predatory in his gaze, a calculation that made skin crawl. She wanted to shield her daughter from that look, but she knew Emma had to do this. They'd come too far to turn back now. Judge watched from her bench, her hands folded in front of her expression carefully neutral but her eyes betraying deep emotion. She'd been a judge for nearly 3 decades, but she'd never felt the weight of responsibility quite like this. If she mishandled this moment, if she pushed too hard or failed to protect this child adequately, the damage could be irreparable, not just to Emma, but to her ability to testify to the case, to the precedent she was trying to set. "Miss Martinez," Judge said gently as Emma approached the witness stand, "thank you for being here today. I know this is very difficult, and I want you to know how brave you are." Emma nodded but didn't speak. Her eyes were fixed on the witness stand, a raised platform with a chair that seemed enormous, designed for adults, not frightened children. The height of it alone was intimidating, making the witness feel exposed and vulnerable. Tom Henderson, the bailiff, had anticipated this problem. During the recess, he'd quietly arranged for a small step stool and a cushion to be placed at the witness stand, making it more accessible for Emma's small frame. It was a tiny gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the care everyone was trying to take. Jake guided Bailey to a specific spot beside the witness stand, close enough for Emma to touch, but positioned so the dog wouldn't obstruct anyone's view or interfere with court procedures. He'd done this calculation before in other courtrooms, finding the perfect balance between support and discretion. "Emma," Judge continued, "Bailey is going to sit right there beside you. An officer will be standing just a few feet away. Your mother will be sitting right over there." She pointed to a chair that had been positioned in Emma's direct line of sight, where you can see her the whole time. "You're surrounded by people who care about you and want to keep you safe." Emma climbed onto the witness stand with Tom's help, settling onto the cushioned chair that made her just tall enough to see over the edge. She immediately reached down, her small hand finding Bailey's head. The dog leaned into her touch, providing that crucial tactile connection that grounded Emma in the present moment. Approached slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She'd prosecuted dozens of cases involving child witnesses, and she knew the next few minutes would determine everything. Push too hard, and Emma would shut down. Move too slowly, and the child's courage might falter. It was a delicate balance that required every ounce of her experience and intuition. "Hi, Emma," said warmly, stopping a respectful distance away. "My name is Ms., but you can call me if that's easier. I'm going to ask you some questions, and you can take all the time you need to answer them. If you need a break, just say so. If you need to pet Bailey, that's perfectly fine. This is your time, and we're going to go at your pace. Does that sound okay?" Emma nodded, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Okay." "Let's start with some easy questions," said, keeping her tone conversational. "Can you tell me your full name?" "Emma Sophia Martinez." The words came out softly but clearly. "And how old are you, Emma?" "7. I'll be 8 in January." What grade are you in? Second grade, Mrs. Class. These were simple questions, designed to get Emma comfortable with speaking aloud, with hearing her own voice in this intimidating space. Could see the child's shoulders gradually relaxing, her grip on Bailey's fur becoming less desperate and more habitual. Emma, do you know why you're here today? Asked gently. Emma's breathing quickened slightly, but she nodded. Because of what happened to Mrs. That's right, and I know this is very hard to talk about, but I need you to tell the judge what you saw. Can you do that? Emma looked down at Bailey, and the dog gazed back with those impossibly understanding eyes. Emma's fingers traced patterns in the golden fur, circles, lines, spirals, finding comfort in the repetitive motion. I can try, Emma whispered. That's all anyone can ask, said. Let's start at the beginning. Can you tell me about Mrs.? What kind of person was she? This was a strategic question, starting with something positive, allowing Emma to remember Mrs. as a living, vibrant person before discussing her death. It was a technique had learned from trauma therapists, and it helped witnesses connect to their motivation for testifying. She was nice, Emma said, her voice growing slightly stronger. She lived next door to us, in the blue house with the white flowers. She always had candy, the strawberry ones, and she had a cat named Mr. Whiskers who was orange and fat. A tiny smile flickered across Emma's face at the memory. She used to tell me stories about when she was young in China, about dragons and emperors and magic mountains. Wiped tears from her eyes, remembering those afternoon visits when Mrs. would invite Emma over for tea and stories. Those memories felt like they belonged to a different lifetime now. She sounds like a wonderful neighbor, said. Now, Emma, I need to ask you about Thursday, March 14th. That was 6 months ago. Do you remember that night? The small smile vanished from Emma's face. Her hand gripped Bailey's fur more tightly, and the dog responded by pressing closer, her warm body a steady presence against Emma's leg. Yes, Emma whispered, I remember. Can you tell me what happened that night? Start wherever feels right to you. Emma was quiet for a long moment. The courtroom remained absolutely silent, no one daring to even shift in their seats. The only sound was the soft clicking of the stenographer's keys and Bailey's gentle breathing. I couldn't sleep, Emma finally began, her voice so soft that Judge had to lean forward to hear. I kept having bad dreams about Buddy, about the car that hit him, about how he looked after. She couldn't finish that sentence, but everyone understood. Take your time, encouraged. I went downstairs to get water, Emma continued. The house was dark and quiet. Mommy was asleep. I got my water and I was going to go back upstairs, but then I looked out the kitchen window. We have a big window over the sink that looks out at the street. What did you see when you looked out the window? Mrs. Emma's voice cracked slightly. She was taking out her trash. She always did it late on Thursdays because that's when trash pickup was, and she said if she put it out too early, the raccoons would make a mess. Nodded encouragingly. What was Mrs. wearing? Her nightgown, the one with little flowers on it, and her pink fuzzy slippers. I always thought those slippers looked so comfortable. Emma's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them back, determined to continue. She was humming. I couldn't hear it through the window, but I could tell because her mouth was moving the way it did when she hummed. What happened next, Emma? This was it, the crucial moment. Emma's breathing became rapid and shallow. Her entire body tensed. Bailey immediately responded, standing up and placing her front paws on the edge of the witness stand, bringing her face level with Emma's. It was a move Jake had seen the dog make before, an instinctive response to extreme distress. Emma buried her face in Bailey's neck, breathing in the dog's warm, comforting scent. The courtroom waited. Judge made no move to intervene, understanding that this moment of connection was necessary. After nearly a minute, Emma pulled back slightly, her arms still around Bailey's neck, and continued speaking, her voice muffled but audible. A man came out from the side of the house, Mrs. House. He was in the shadows, so at first I couldn't see him very well. He was wearing dark clothes, jeans, and a hoodie. The hoodie had white letters on it, but I couldn't read all of them, just some letters. Emma paused, gathering courage. Mrs. didn't see him at first. She was just putting the trash can at the curb. Then what happened? His voice was gentle but firm, keeping Emma anchored to the narrative. He came up behind her really fast. He grabbed her purse. She had it hanging on her shoulder. She screamed and tried to hold onto it, but he pulled really hard. Tears were streaming down Emma's face now, but she kept talking, the words pouring out like water finally released from a broken dam. She fell down. She hit the ground hard, and I heard her crying out. And then. Emma was trembling violently now. Bailey pressed closer, and Jake took a small step forward, ready to intervene if Emma couldn't continue. But the little girl lifted her head, and when she spoke again, her voice was clearer than it had been all day. And then he kicked her, multiple times, even after she let go of the purse, even after she stopped moving, he kept kicking her. Emma's voice rose slightly, emotion breaking through. She was just lying there and he kept hurting her, and I wanted to scream, I wanted to help, but I was so scared. I thought if I made noise he'd see me. He'd come into our house. He'd hurt Mommy. He'd hurt me. Let Emma's words hang in the air for a moment before asking the question they'd been building toward. Emma, did you see the man's face? Yes. Emma's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried absolute certainty. After he stopped kicking Mrs., he picked up her purse and walked under the streetlight. That's when I saw his face clearly. Emma said gently but firmly, "Is the man you saw that night in this courtroom today?" This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the identification that would make or break the case. Emma's eyes slowly moved from to scan the courtroom. They passed over her mother, over Judge, over the court personnel, and finally settled on the defense table. On stared back at her, his face impassive, but Emma could see it in his eyes, the same cold calculation she'd seen that night when he'd walked through the streetlight, the same heartless efficiency. For a moment she was 7 years old again, watching through a window, frozen with terror. But then Bailey shifted, pressing her warm body more firmly against Emma's side, reminding her that she wasn't alone anymore, that she was safe, that she had a voice, and it was time to use it. Emma lifted her hand, small and trembling but steady enough, and pointed directly at. "That's him," she said, her voice ringing out clearly across the silent courtroom. "That's the man who hurt Mrs. That's the man who killed her." The courtroom erupted. The eruption in the courtroom was immediate and chaotic. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gallery like a wave. Mrs. family members, sitting in the front row, broke into tears, some of relief, some of renewed grief. His face went pale, then flushed crimson with rage. He lunged forward in his seat, only to be restrained by his attorney and the bailiff, who'd moved with remarkable speed. "That's enough." Judge's gavel cracked down 3 times, each bang reverberating through the room like thunder. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom, or I will clear it entirely." Emma flinched at the sudden noise and commotion, her small body curling inward. Bailey immediately positioned herself more protectively, standing fully now between Emma and the defense table, her usually gentle demeanor shifting to something more alert, more guarding. Jake's hand moved to Bailey's vest, ready to intervene, but the dog knew exactly what she was doing. "Your Honor, I need a recess." Richard Harrison was on his feet, his face nearly purple. "My client is clearly being prejudiced by this circus. A child who's been coached, a dog that's designed to manipulate emotions. This is a travesty of justice." But Judge had had enough. "Mr. Harrison, you will sit down and you will be quiet, or you will be held in contempt. Do I make myself clear?" The attorney sat, but his jaw was clenched so tightly it looked painful, whispered urgently in his ear, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. There was pure hatred in that gaze, a barely concealed threat that made stand up instinctively, ready to physically shield her daughter if necessary. remained calm, allowing the disruption to settle before continuing. She'd expected this reaction, had actually counted on it. Loss of composure would be noted by everyone present. Guilty men panicked. Innocent men stayed calm. Emma said gently, drawing the child's attention back to her, away from his hateful stare, "I know that was very hard. You did wonderfully. I just have a few more questions and then we'll be done. Can you keep going?" Emma nodded, her face buried against Bailey's neck, but she was listening. "You said the man walked under the streetlight. How far away was the streetlight from where you were standing?" Emma pulled back slightly, thinking. Maybe as far as from here to that wall." She pointed to the back of the courtroom, approximately 40 feet away. "And was there anything blocking your view? Any trees or cars?" "No, Mrs. Yard is really neat and open. She didn't like tall bushes because she said they blocked her view of the neighborhood. The streetlight was really bright. It's one of those new LED ones that the city put in last year." Nodded. "How long did you see his face?" "Maybe, like when you count to 10, maybe a little longer." He was looking through her purse, taking things out and putting them in his pockets. His hood had fallen back so I could see his whole face. He had a scar. Emma touched her own cheek, tracing a line. Right here, it was kind of curved like a smile, but not a happy smile. A murmur went through the courtroom. Did indeed have a distinctive curved scar on his left cheek, the result of a knife fight in his teens. It was an identifying mark that had been noted in his arrest record. "Emma, what did you do after you saw what happened to Mrs.?" Emma's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I was so scared. I ran upstairs to Mommy's room. I was shaking so hard I could barely wake her up. When I finally did, I couldn't talk right. I just kept pointing at the window and crying. Mommy called 911, but—" Emma's voice cracked. "But I think it was too late. I think Mrs. was already. "You did everything you could," said firmly. "You were incredibly brave. Your testimony helped the police know who to look for. You helped make sure Mrs.'s family would know the truth about what happened." Was openly sobbing now, pride and heartbreak warring on her face. Jennifer had one hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. Even Tom Henderson, the grizzled bailiff who'd seen everything in his 20 years, had to turn away to compose himself. Glanced at her notes, then at Judge. "Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness." Judge nodded, then turned to the defense table. "Mr. Harrison, do you wish to cross-examine?" It was a formality. The defense had every right to question Emma, but it was also a test. Harrison looked at Emma, then at Bailey, then at the faces of everyone in the courtroom who had just watched this traumatized child summon impossible courage to tell her truth. He leaned over to confer with, whose face was contorted with barely suppressed fury. "Mr. Harrison," Judge prompted. Harrison stood slowly. "Your Honor, I would like to reserve the right to recall this witness, but at this time I have no questions." It was the smart play, and everyone knew it. Cross-examining a traumatized 7-year-old who just provided such compelling testimony would have been PR suicide, even if it was legally appropriate. The jury, when it was eventually seated, would have him for it. "Very well," Judge said. "Miss Martinez, you may step down. Thank you for your courage today." Emma slid off the witness stand on shaky legs, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The ordeal was over. She'd done it. She'd found her voice and used it to speak for Mrs., to tell the truth that had been locked inside her for so long. Bailey walked beside her as Jake guided them toward, who swept Emma up in her arms despite the girl being almost too big to carry. Mother and daughter clung to each other, both crying, both releasing months of pent-up fear and pain. The trial continued over the following days. Other witnesses, forensic experts, police officers, neighbors who'd heard the commotion. But everyone knew that Emma's testimony had been the turning point. Her detailed identification, her clear recall of events, her obvious truthfulness had provided the prosecution with an unshakable foundation. defense crumbled piece by piece. His alibi fell apart under scrutiny. Physical evidence, including Mrs. credit cards found in his apartment, contradicted his claims of innocence. The white lettering on his hoodie that Emma had partially seen matched a jacket seized from his closet, and that distinctive curved scar eliminated any possibility of mistaken identity. 3 weeks later, the jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom exploded with emotion as the verdict was read. Mrs. Family wept with relief and vindication, closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility lift from her shoulders. Emma, who had been allowed to attend with Bailey by her side, squeezed her mother's hand tightly. Showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs, but as he passed Emma's row, he turned his head to look at her one final time. Emma met his gaze steadily, one hand resting on Bailey's head. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She had found her voice and with it her power. After the courtroom cleared, Judge did something unprecedented. She stepped down from her bench, removed her robes to reveal the simple blouse and slacks underneath, and approached Emma directly. The formality of her position set aside, she was just a grandmother, a woman who cared deeply about justice. Kneeling to Emma's level, Judge pulled out a small velvet box. "Emma, I want you to have something." She opened the box to reveal a medal, specially commissioned, with words engraved on its surface. "Courage in Court, Emma Martinez, for speaking truth with bravery." Emma's eyes widened as the judge pinned the medal to her dress. "You are the bravest person I have ever met in all my years as a judge," said, her voice thick with emotion. "What you did today, what you've done throughout this whole process, will change how we help other children who experience trauma. You're a hero, Emma. Don't ever forget that." Emma threw her arms around the judge's neck and held her tightly, feeling tears stream down her own face. When they pulled apart, Emma looked up with those dark, still healing eyes and said, "Thank you for letting Bailey stay with me. I couldn't have done it without her." "I know, sweetheart," said. "That's why I fought so hard to make it happen." The local news picked up the story within hours. By evening, it had gone regional. By the next morning, it was national news. "Therapy Dog Helps Traumatized Child Find Her Voice," read one headline. "Judge's Compassionate Decision Leads to Justice," proclaimed another. News crews gathered outside the courthouse, wanting interviews, wanting to tell this story that had captured hearts across the country. Gave a statement praising Emma's bravery and highlighting the importance of therapy dog programs in courts. Judge held a press conference announcing an expansion of the courthouse's therapy animal initiative, with funding already pouring in from donors who'd been moved by Emma's story. Officer Jake and Bailey were interviewed, with Jake passionately advocating for more training programs and resources for therapy dogs in judicial settings. But the most powerful image, the one that went viral on social media, appearing on news broadcasts and front pages, was a photograph taken just after the verdict. It showed Emma standing between Judge and Bailey, her medal gleaming on her chest, a genuine smile on her face for the first time in months. Bailey sat beside her, tail wagging, looking every bit the hero she was. And in the background, slightly out of focus but unmistakably present, was her face radiant with pride and relief. The caption that accompanied the photo was simple: "Justice, compassion, and healing." Within weeks, 3 other states had contacted Judge's court, wanting to implement similar programs. Within months, legislation was being drafted to formally protect the rights of vulnerable witnesses to have therapy animals present during testimony. Emma's case became a landmark precedent, cited in law journals and trauma therapy textbooks. But for Emma herself, the most important change wasn't in courtrooms or legislation, it was internal. The nightmares gradually became less frequent. Her voice, once locked away by trauma, grew stronger every day. She returned to school, where teachers marveled at her resilience. She made friends again, laughed again, dreamed again. And every Thursday afternoon, Officer would bring Bailey to visit Emma at her home. The little girl and the golden retriever would sit together in the backyard, Emma telling Bailey about her week, her hopes, her healing. Sometimes they just sit in comfortable silence, Emma's hand resting in Bailey's fur, both of them content in each other's presence. Would watch from the kitchen window, tears of gratitude streaming down her face, amazed at how far her daughter had come. The little girl who couldn't speak had found her voice. The traumatized child who couldn't face the world had stood in a courtroom and demanded justice. And it had all started with a simple moment. A frightened child pointing at a golden retriever and whispering, "Buddy." Sometimes thought, miracles came on 4 legs with a wagging tail. Sometimes healing began with a single act of compassion. Sometimes justice required not just following the rules, but having the courage to bend them for something greater. Mrs. had justice at last. Emma had her voice back. And the world had learned that sometimes the most powerful force in a courtroom wasn't the law, it was love. Retrié 3 months had passed since the verdict, and autumn had painted in shades of gold and amber that seemed to mirror the warmth slowly returning to Emma's life. The leaves fell from trees like confetti, celebrating the quiet miracles that happened when trauma began to heal and broken spirits learned to hope again. Emma stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully adjusting her new dress, a deep purple that had let her pick out herself. The metal judge had given her was pinned carefully to her chest, polished until it gleamed. Today was special. Today she was going back to the courthouse, but not because she had to, because she wanted to. "You look beautiful, me," said from the doorway, her eyes misty. These days she cried for different reasons, not from fear or heartbreak, but from overwhelming pride and gratitude. Her daughter was coming back to her, piece by piece, word by word, smile by smile. "Do you think Bailey will remember me?" Emma asked, a hint of her old anxiety creeping into her voice. Smiled, "Sweetheart, I think Bailey could never forget you. You two are bonded forever." The courthouse looked different in the gentle autumn sunlight. Less intimidating, more like the place where Emma had discovered her own strength rather than the place that had once terrified her. As they walked up the stone steps, Emma didn't hesitate or hide behind her mother. She walked on her own 2 feet, head held high, ready to face whatever came next. The ceremony was being held in the main courtroom, the same room where Emma had, but today it had been transformed. Colorful banners hung from the walls, balloons clustered in corners, and chairs had been arranged theater-style to accommodate the crowd of people who'd gathered. Local officials, courthouse staff, news reporters, and community members filled the space with warm chatter. But Emma's eyes immediately found what she was looking for. Bailey sat near the front, her golden coat brushed to perfection, wearing a new vest that read Certified Courthouse Therapy Dog Pioneer. Beside her stood Officer Jake in his dress uniform, and the moment Bailey spotted Emma, her tail began wagging with such enthusiasm that her whole body wiggled. "Bailey!" Emma didn't run. She'd learned that therapy dogs needed to maintain their composure during official events. But she walked quickly, her face split by a genuine smile that made everyone in the room feel the joy radiating from this once silent child. Jake gave the release command and Bailey trotted to Emma, who dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck. "I missed you so much," Emma whispered into Bailey's fur. "I've been practicing my reading so I could read to you, and I'm getting better at math. And I joined the school choir, can you believe it, me, singing in front of people." Bailey licked Emma's cheek, her tail never stopping its happy rhythm. It had only been 3 weeks since their last visit, but to both of them, it felt like forever. Their bond had been forged in trauma but had transformed into something pure and beautiful, a friendship that transcended species and circumstance. "Emma Martinez," a familiar voice called out, warm and authoritative. Judge stood at the front of the room, now wearing a regular pantsuit instead of her judicial robes, looking more like someone's grandmother than a formidable judge. "Would you please come up here?" Emma stood, keeping one hand on Bailey's head as she walked to the front. The crowd broke into applause and Emma's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't hide or look away. She was learning to accept recognition, to understand that her courage deserved to be celebrated. 3 months ago, Judge began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, I made a decision that some people thought was risky, unprecedented, and potentially problematic. I allowed a therapy dog to accompany a traumatized child witness during testimony. Some said it was too emotional, too manipulative, that it would set a dangerous precedent. She paused, looking directly at Emma with infinite gentleness. But I believed then, and I know now, that justice is not served when we silence the vulnerable in the name of procedure. Justice is not served when we prioritize tradition over compassion. And justice is certainly not served when we allow trauma to be the final word in a victim's story. The crowd murmured in agreement. Sitting in the front row, nodded vigorously. Even some of the older judges who'd initially questioned decision were present, their expressions thoughtful and respectful. Today, I'm honored to announce the official establishment of the Courthouse Therapy Dog Program, fully funded and permanently implemented in our judicial system. Judge gestured to a banner being unveiled on the wall. It showed Bailey's image alongside the program's mission statement. This program will ensure that vulnerable witnesses, especially children and trauma survivors, have access to trained therapy animals during legal proceedings. The applause was thunderous. Emma clapped too, looking up at the banner with wonder. That was her Bailey, her friend. And now Bailey would help so many other people the way she'd helped Emma. But that's not all, Judge continued. Emma, I want you to know that your courage has inspired change far beyond this courthouse. 5 other states have contacted us about implementing similar programs. Legislation is being drafted to protect the rights of vulnerable witnesses nationwide. And trauma therapists are using your case as a teaching example of how healing can happen when we approach pain with compassion instead of fear. She knelt down to Emma's level, just as she had 3 months ago, treating this child not as a case number or a witness, but as a person worthy of respect and eye-level conversation. Emma, you are the reason all of this is happening. Your bravery changed everything. And today, I want to give you something that represents not just what you've done, but who you are. Judge handed Emma a large framed photograph. It showed Emma at the witness stand, one hand on Bailey's head, her face determined despite the tears on her cheeks. It had been taken by a court photographer during her testimony, and it captured the exact moment when fear transformed into courage. This is you, Emma, Judge said softly. This is you being the bravest version of yourself. On days when you feel scared or uncertain, I want you to look at this picture and remember, you have already faced your worst fears and survived. You have already spoken your truth when it felt impossible. You are stronger than you know. Emma stared at the photograph, seeing herself through new eyes. She barely recognized the girl in the picture. That terrified child seemed like someone from another lifetime. But she remembered that moment, remembered the weight of impossible courage, remembered Bailey's steadying presence. Thank you, Emma whispered, then louder. Thank you for believing in me. But the surprises weren't over. Officer stepped forward, a warm smile on his weathered face. Emma, I have something for you too. Well, Bailey and I both do. He handed her an official-looking certificate with ribbons and seals. Emma's eyes widened as she read, Honorary Junior Therapy Dog Handler, Emma Martinez, in recognition of her extraordinary bond with Bailey and her dedication to helping others heal from trauma. You're part of our team now, Jake explained. Whenever you visit Bailey, you can help with her training exercises. And when you're older, if you're interested, we'd love to have you volunteer with our program. You understand better than anyone what these dogs can do, and your voice could help so many other children. Emma looked down at Bailey, who gazed back with those impossibly knowing eyes. Really, I can really help. Really, Jake confirmed. Bailey chose you that first day, Emma. She knew you were special, and we'd be honored to have you as part of what we do. couldn't hold back her tears anymore. She'd watched her daughter transform from a silent, broken shell into this confident, hopeful child. It felt like witnessing a resurrection. The Emma she'd known before the trauma was returning, but different now. Stronger, deeper, marked by pain but not defined by it. Took the microphone next. "Emma, there's one more piece of news I'd like to share. Mrs. Family has established a scholarship fund in her name, the Helen Memorial Scholarship for Brave Young Voices. It will provide financial support for trauma therapy and support animals for children who witnessed violence. And you, Emma, are the inspiration behind it." Mrs. Daughter stood up from the audience, tears streaming down her face. She approached Emma slowly, not wanting to overwhelm the child, and knelt before her. "My mother loved you," said, her voice breaking. "In her last conversation with me just days before she died, she talked about you. She said you were going to do something important with your life, that she could see it in your eyes. She was right. You gave her justice. You gave our family closure. And now you're helping make sure other children won't have to suffer in silence the way you did." Held out a small jade pendant on a delicate chain, a traditional Chinese symbol of courage and protection. "This belonged to my mother. She wore it every day. I want you to have it, to remember that she believed in you and that her love and strength are with you always." Emma accepted the pendant with trembling hands and gently fastened it around her neck. The jade was warm, as if it still carried some essence of Mrs. Gentle spirit. Emma touched it reverently, feeling the connection to the kind neighbor who had taught her to count in Mandarin and shared strawberry candies, and believed she was special. "I won't forget her," Emma promised. "I'll never forget her." "I know you won't, sweetheart," said, pulling Emma into a gentle hug. As the ceremony continued with speeches and refreshments, Emma found a quiet corner where she could sit with Bailey, processing everything that had happened. The dog laid her head in Emma's lap, and the girl stroked her soft ears, feeling overwhelmed but in the best possible way. Jake approached with a knowing smile. "Big day, huh?" Emma nodded. "It's a lot, but a lot." "I get it," Jake said, settling onto the floor beside them. "Can I tell you something? When I first started working with therapy dogs, I thought my job was to help the dogs help people. But over the years, I've learned something important. The dogs don't just help the people they visit. They help each other too, in a way. Every person Bailey connects with, every life she touches, it adds to who she is. You've made Bailey better at her job, Emma. You've taught her things I never could." Emma looked at Bailey with wonder. "Really? I helped her?" "Absolutely. She learned from you what true courage looks like. She learned that healing isn't linear or simple. She learned that sometimes the bravest thing someone can do is just show up and try, even when they're terrified." Jake smiled. "You and Bailey, your partners, you healed each other." A court photographer approached respectfully. "Excuse me, Emma, would you be willing to take a few photos? The program would love to use them for awareness and fundraising." Emma looked uncertain, but Bailey stood up and wagged her tail as if encouraging her. Emma took a deep breath, the kind of breath that had taught her, the kind that centered and strengthened, and nodded. "Okay, but Bailey has to be in all of them." "I wouldn't have it any other way," the photographer said with a grin. They took dozens of photos, Emma and Bailey sitting together, Emma reading to Bailey from a children's book, Emma holding her medal and certificate while Bailey sat proudly beside her. In every single shot, Emma's smile was genuine, her eyes bright with hope rather than haunted by fear. As the afternoon wore on and the ceremony wound down, Judge pulled Emma aside one final time. "Emma, there's one more thing, something I wanted to tell you privately." The judge's eyes were serious but kind. "I've been a judge for almost 30 years, and I've made thousands of decisions. Some good, some questionable, some I still wonder about late at night. But allowing Bailey to be with you during your testimony, that was the best decision I've ever made from the bench. Not because it helped win a case or set a precedent, but because it helped a little girl find her voice. And that voice is changing the world." Emma threw her arms around Judge's waist, hugging her tightly. "Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself." Held Emma close, feeling her own heart swell with emotion. This was why she'd become a judge, not for the power or prestige, but for moments like this, for the chance to tip the scales toward justice and compassion and hope. As Emma prepared to leave, Emma made one last stop. She approached the banner showing Bailey's image and the therapy dog program's mission statement. Reaching up, she touched the photo of Bailey gently. "Thank you, Buddy," she whispered. "Thank you for sending her to me." Whether Buddy had truly sent Bailey, whether it was fate or chance or divine intervention, Emma would never know for certain. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that in her darkest moment, when her voice had been stolen and her spirit broken, a golden retriever with gentle eyes and an infinite capacity for love had appeared. And everything had changed. As they walked out of the courthouse into the golden afternoon sunlight, Emma held her mother's hand with her right hand and carried the framed photograph under her left arm. The jade pendant rested against her heart, her medal gleamed on her chest, and her future, once so dark and uncertain, now stretched ahead filled with possibility. She had found her voice. She had found her courage. She had found healing. And she had found her purpose, to help other children like her, to speak for those who couldn't yet speak for themselves, to be living proof that trauma didn't have to be the end of the story. Behind them, still visible through the courthouse windows, Bailey sat with Officer, watching Emma leave. The dog's tail wagged slowly, contentedly. She had done her job. She had helped a broken child heal. And tomorrow, there would be someone else who needed her, someone else who was scared and hurt and lost. And Bailey would be there, just as she'd been there for Emma. Because that's what therapy dogs do. They show up. They love unconditionally. And they remind us all that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone. The end.